The Islamic Republic of Iran, or better known as just Iran, an ancient land with a diverse and sophisticated people, a human capital which has been artificially suppressed since 1979 by a regime of quasi-clerics led by Khomeini himself. This regime has been a liability not just for the people of Iran or the people of the region, but as we recently found out, to the entire world. This Khomeini-led clerical regime has been the source of instability all across the region. This regime started wars and civil wars from Syria to Yemen. This regime has been militarily, politically, and financially supporting all sorts of douchebags and unsavory folks from all across the region, whether it's Hezbollah in Lebanon or Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen or Assad in Syria. With all this being said, what if I told you that in my view, a revolution in Iran is not only possible, but inevitable? Hi, my name is Benjamin, and today we'll go over 3 things that we, as the rest of the world, can do to help and speed up the inevitable downfall of this evil terrorist regime. Firstly, before we go into the 3 steps which I believe will help us bring down this regime, let me tell you in what way I think the world has changed, and for the worse from Iran's perspective. This regime was already standing on its last feet, even before Masa Amini. With the beginning of the Ukraine war, when Russia first invaded Ukraine, Iran started supplying the Russians with ballistic missiles and Shahed drones, the suicide drones that we all know about. That act itself burst the European bubble, a bubble which they've been living in, not realizing that Iran is not just a liability for people in the region, but rather is a problem for Europe as well. They realized that those drones, the Shahed drones and the ballistic missiles, will probably not only be used on Israel or UAE or Saudi Arabia. They started understanding that the Middle East is not like Las Vegas. Whatever happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East, and those same suicide drones can be used and will be used on European cities. Before the Ukraine war, the Europeans, specifically the European Union, was more than happy to sign the Iran deal for their own selfish, energy-based reasons. But now they are realizing that Iran and Russia are on the same side, and you cannot decouple one from the other. Alright, enough beating around the bush. So, how do we solve this? How do we get rid of this terrible regime? First step, we must recognize an official government in exile. A government that will be recognized by most, if not all, democratic countries, and ideally even the UN. Now, I don't know who those candidates can be, because that's a whole video all by itself, but potentially it could be the Shah, who is currently, or at least the descendant of the Shah, who's currently sitting in the US, or alternatively, it could be Maryam Rajavi from Mujahideen Khalq. Either way, whoever that may be, they need to be recognized by everyone, unanimously. Now, why is that? Why recognizing this government, this shadow government in exile, so important? The reason it's important is because stability is key. People want to make sure they can go to work the next day. People will not rebel against the government, a tyrannical, terrible government that they themselves recognize as such, because they're worried about the next day. They don't want their country to look like Syria. People don't want anarchy for their kids. People want to send their kids to school. People want to be able to go to work, even if that means a dictatorship. And Khomeini himself knew that very well, because it was him, almost every interview, when he was sitting in his villa in Paris up until 1979, he would make sure he would mention that after they pull off the revolution, people will go to work the next day. That's his words verbatim. And he kept highlighting that because people are afraid of the unknown. People don't want anarchy and chaos in the streets. A government in exile, which will be recognized by the whole world. This way, Iranians can take solace in the fact that after the revolution, the day after, they have already a leadership that is recognized around the world and will be able to step in and take control and essentially govern. Secondly, the Islamic Republic of Iran needs to be isolated. In this case, particularly diplomatically. It makes no sense that aircraft that belong to the official Iranian carrier, the national carrier, are able to land in European capitals. The fact that nations like Canada and many nations, most nations in the European Union, still do not recognize the IRGC as a terrorist organization, as a terrorist entity, essentially. That is completely unacceptable. The fact that Iranian vessels can dock at Brazilian ports, for example, that is completely unacceptable, and that needs to change. Up until now, a lot of Western nations, particularly democratic, particularly European nations, were hesitant to isolating Iran in the hopes of getting close to Iran, in the hopes of getting some of the energy from Iran, in the hopes to decouple themselves from Russia and its axis. They found out that Iran is in fact in the same axis as Russia. And quite frankly, any talk of the Iran deal today seems completely obsolete and irrelevant. Which means there is in fact right now political will to isolate this regime. It needs to be done, and it will be done. In this current context of Russia invading Ukraine and bombing major cities in Europe, imagine Iran having nuclear weapons. They're almost there and nobody's paying attention to that. This is a regime that clearly does not care about international norms. Imagine a regime like this having access to nuclear weapons. Imagine they start loading nukes on drones or their ballistic missiles. And lastly, sanctions. Bring back the real sanctions, the biting sanctions. Did you know that Iran's GDP today is almost, nearing $2 trillion? A lot of it is thanks to the fact that the Biden administration, when they came to power, they actually removed some of the biting sanctions and allowed Iran to grow and become not just a regional power, but potentially a global power. These sanctions were particularly biting to countries that used to deal with Iran, to do financial dealings with Iran, particularly China. Chinese banks were sanctioned and Chinese financial institutions were genuinely afraid and worried about dealing with Iran, and they were hesitant, and therefore that's why they didn't do it. That is no longer the case. Chinese banks and Chinese financial institutions are terrified of US sanctions. Their self-preservation is paramount to them. There's no amount of love between them and Iran that would change that. These sanctions worked, but now China, the People's Republic of China, is buying a lot of its oil, a lot of its energy from Iran, even though they're getting it for quite cheap, but they're still getting most of their energy, or at least a lot of it, from Iran, therefore sustaining this awful, corrupt regime. During the previous US administration, Iran actually exported about 200,000 barrels of crude oil. Today, we're talking close to 2 to 3 million barrels. In order to speed up the downfall of this regime, sanctions, particularly sanctions that would look a lot more like the sanctions we had during the Trump administration, should make a comeback. Now, a little final comment before I let you go. I cannot have you leaving my video so pessimistic. I personally am actually quite optimistic for Iran and for its people. To use Dr. Mordecai Kedar's analogy, a revolution in Iran is analogous to a pregnant woman. Each major protest and revolt is sort of like a contraction, and the baby itself is analogous to a revolution in this context. As the contractions become more and more common and their frequency goes up, that tends to be an indication that you're closer to delivery. Same goes here. We can see that protests are becoming more frequent and are increasing in their intensity, essentially. I actually think it's only a matter of time before they board a plane and fly somewhere to be an exile in some dictatorship. I actually think it's only a matter of time. But for us to speed up this process, us, the rest of the world, these are the 3 steps I would suggest.